We now turn back to politics and bring in Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida. In his new book, Firebrand, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the MAGA Revolution, Gaetz lays out his vision for the future of populism and the Make America Great Again movement. Thanks so much for coming back on the show, Congressman.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the COVID-19 milestone that we hit today. 200,000 American lives lost, and that includes more than 13,000 deaths in your state of Florida. You've praised the Trump administration's handling of the pandemic, but now that we're at this milestone, would you say that this death toll was inevitable?
Every milestone is tragic. I don't know that any death is inevitable. I do know that the original projections contemplated 2.5 million people potentially dying, and while 200,000 is not acceptable, while even 2 would not be acceptable, this is certainly well below that threshold. I would say in Florida's defense, we have had one of the lowest mortality rates in the entire country, and currently our positivity rate is down below 3% on a 3-day rolling average, or I'm sorry, down below 4% on a 3-day rolling average, and so we are seeing conditions improve.
Let's take a listen to President Trump last night at a rally in Ohio.
Now we know it affects elderly people with heart problems and other problems. If they have other problems, that's what it really affects. That's it. It affects virtually nobody. It's an amazing thing.
Was that the right thing to say? Because as we know, many young and healthy people have also died of COVID-19. Specifically, 21% of those who were under the age of 65 have lost their life in this country to COVID-19.
Right, and only 6% of those who've lost their life, according to the CDC, did not have a comorbidity. So when the president speaks to those comorbidities, obviously, he's speaking to the science, and it is true that we have to take special protection over the seniors and elderly populations throughout the country. In Florida, that's why we went on offense against the virus in our nursing homes and in our assisted living facilities. But this is obviously something we're going to continue to deal with until we have a vaccine. Fortunately, based on the reports we're getting from Moderna and Pfizer, we're closer than we ever could have imagined as a consequence of Operation Warp Speed.
I'm going to get to your book in just one second. Just want to follow up there, because if you heard him at the rally, he said that it affects virtually nobody. Virtually nobody, is that an accurate statement? I mean, 1/3 of Americans say that they know someone who's died or been hospitalized because of COVID-19.
Yeah, I would say that the lockdowns have likely impacted a lot more Americans than even the virus or the illness have. And the president's comments about virtually nobody were in the context of the statements about the comorbidities, elderly populations, people who have diabetes, and those types of other diseases. And so, again, healthy Americans who don't have a comorbidity have a very low likelihood of fatality. But I would also remind everyone that we don't know the long-term effects of COVID. We, for example, don't know if it will cause blood clots in folks later in life. The impact on the digestive system is one that's still being studied. So I wouldn't suggest that we know the full story until we get a little further down the road.
But would you agree with the president that it's affected virtually nobody?
Well, again, I think that has to be evaluated in the context of the types of people who are impacted most. That's how I read his statements. I speak for myself, and I would say that the deaths that we've had are tragic, but it's well below the 2 and 2.5 million that were originally projected as a possibility on the higher end.
So you're a self-described firebrand. How important is it to you to try to reach across the aisle, or is politics inevitably a blood sport? And to that point, on the battle of the Supreme Court vacancy, do you think that Senate Republicans need any justification at all to vote on a Trump nominee during an election year, or should it be enough that they can because they have the power?
The Republicans have the power, and I suggest we use it. If the Democrats had the presidency and the Senate, you better believe they'd be confirming a Supreme Court justice. I've heard a lot of Democrats today complain about the Merrick Garland situation, but Democrats hadn't consolidated sufficient power to be able to seat Merrick Garland because they didn't have the Senate. I do think we have to reach across the aisle, and in my book Firebrand, which is out today, I specifically identified the environment as one of those issues. Climate change is real. It is an absolute threat to humanity, and if we don't start working on these generational challenges together, I fear that the politics of paralysis will limit the type of progress that we can make. And, you know, I lay out ideas like improving our electric grid, improving our infrastructure, and that ought to bring Republicans and Democrats together.
And if Biden wins and the Democrats flip the Senate in November, would it be fair for Biden to try to expand the Supreme Court if he can, or should he follow the precedent of just 9 justices?
Well, I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a bit of an opinion on that. She thought that 9 was the right number. You know, the Democrats have fully embraced the FDR economic policies. I didn't know they were going to embrace the FDR court packing policies. They might want to check history and see how that went for the last president that tried it. I think that for all the talk from Nancy Pelosi and Democrats in Washington about how Donald Trump threatens to shake our institutions and burn them to the ground, it's the Democrats now talking about potentially using impeachment as a procedural jam on the confirmation process, or even, for goodness sakes, expanding the Supreme Court. That's more institutional violence than they've ever accused Donald Trump of.
Just curious, because you brought up the point of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her thoughts about the number of justices. Also, reportedly, her granddaughter said that it was her wish that her seat would not be filled until after the election. Do you think that that should be given any weight?
Well, there is no prevailing wish provision of the Constitution. The Constitution's pretty clear that the Senate has an obligation to advise and consent, and withholding that consent just because an election is around the corner is about like watching an NBA basketball team give up in the fourth quarter because they want to know who the coach is going to be in the following year. We're elected for full terms. We have an obligation to meet our constitutional duties during those terms, and any senators who reject their duties ought to be rejected by their voters.
In your book, you also discuss the future of populism and the Make America Great Revolution. What do those movements look like if Trump does lose to Biden in November?
I believe that Trump is necessary to maintain a brand of conservatism that is America first. I worry that if Joe Biden wins, Republicans will go back to the Mitt Romney, John Kasich, Jeb Bush, Cheney days of invading everywhere in the world and inviting illegal immigrants to cross our border so that multinational corporations can benefit from cheap labor. President Trump has really led a political realignment in our country on trade, on immigration, on foreign policy, and I'm here to make sure that that continues well beyond his tenure in office.
Congressman, lastly, I'd just like to give you a chance to plug the book again, Firebrand. What would you hope that the takeaway is for readers?
Well, Washington is a deeply corrupt place, and the only way to fix it is to have greater civic engagement. I'm the only Republican in Congress who doesn't take money from political action committees, and so one hope I have is that when readers see how committee assignments are bought and sold for specific dollar amounts, how leaders only move up if they move around a certain amount of campaign cash, that they'll demand a government that is more noble and more I would say, responsive to the great patriotic impulses that I find all around this great country.
Congressman Matt Gaetz, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me again.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.